Thank you, John Paul. That was an excellent overview. And so our next speaker is Bill Dewey from Taylor Shellfish Farms.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for the invitation from the consortium to come participate in the panel. It worked out great for me this week. I just happened to be here with a group of shellfish growers from the East and West Coast, walking the corridors here, so I was glad to take time out to have this opportunity to come address you all. So Taylor Shellfish Farms, for those who may not be familiar, we're based out in Washington State, family-owned business. They've been growing shellfish there in Washington since 1890, and have grown in recent years to be one, as Megan mentioned in the introduction, one of the larger producers in the country of farm shellfish. We have about, I think, 600 employees in our facilities in Washington State, and roughly another 80 up in British Columbia on our facilities up there. So definitely a going concern, doing our part to try to reduce the seafood trade deficit, and looking forward to continuing to do that into the years ahead. As I mentioned, we've been doing this for a long time. So what I'm going to do here in my presentation is just run through a number of slides just showing you some pictures of our farms so you understand the world that I'm coming from, and then shift gears and start talking about food safety and shellfish. So we'll go on a quick ride through some of our shellfish operations here. But as I mentioned, we've been doing this for a long time, back into the early 1900s for Taylor's, and earlier than that for the rest of the industry. We've done this in conjunction with the Native American tribes in Washington State. They're good partners of ours. We work closely together, both them working on our farms and us buying shellfish from them, and collaborating intensively over the years to work on protecting Puget Sound and water quality and the environment there in Washington State. They're great partners of ours. Washington State leads the country in farm shellfish production, and that relates back to what I call an early exercise in marine spatial planning. So shortly after we became a state, in the 1800s, we were depleting our wild resources of native oysters. And so shortly after we became a state, the legislature, some of the first laws they passed were oyster laws. And they took all of the productive oyster lands and made them oyster reserves, not for sale. And then they passed two laws that allowed for barren tide lands to be sold into private ownership, specifically for culturing the oysters. And if you did anything else on that land, the ownership would revert back to the state, but as long as you grew oysters on it, you could own it. And that was pretty fundamental to the industry getting established. About 47,000 acres were sold into private ownership. This is just one example in northern Puget Sound of what those oyster tracts look like, but really at the foundation of why we have such a successful industry in Washington State today is that tideland ownership. So most of us today rely on modern hatcheries to produce the seed for our baby clams, oysters, and mussels for our farms. This is our hatchery on the Head Canal. All these guys have a similar life cycle. They start out as microscopic plankton in the water. So we bring the broodstock in, condition them, spawn them, rear the baby oysters or clams in these tanks. That picture there, there's millions of oysters being introduced into the water there, that brown haze in the water. No artificial food to feed these guys in the hatchery, so a lot of the work in the hatchery is growing multiple different species of marine phytoplankton to feed them as they go through the different larval stages. Ultimately, what we're trying to get are baby shellfish like this coming out of the nurseries to go out to the farms. These are some small oysters, single oysters. When we're growing oysters for shucked oyster meat production, it's a different process. So we'll take the old oyster shells, bag them up in plastic mesh bags, and introduce the larvae that are ready to attach to those shells, and they glue onto the shells. The brown specks you see here are all baby oysters that have been on those shells now for probably 3 or 4 months to get to that size. Those bags are then cut open, the shells piled on the deck of a boat, and then the boat takes them off and goes out to the bed where we're going to plant them and sprays those shells off onto the bottom. And then you go back a few years later and hopefully have a crop that looks something like that. Lots of macroalgae, lots of nutrients associated with those oysters growing there. So lots of macroalgae that grows on the crops. In muddy areas where the ground's too soft to support an oyster crop, we'll suspend them up off the bottom and grow them on lines. We call these intertidal oyster loan lines. We employ a lot of people out there on the beds harvesting our shellfish, some happier than others. These girls are obviously having a little too much fun that day, but lots of employment. All of our jobs are, all of our crops are very manual, labor intensive, so it creates lots of job opportunities out in the rural parts of our state. We grow a lot of single oysters. The oyster industry's changed in recent years to do, we do less shucked meats and more oysters for the half-shell market for the raw bar trade. And so we spend a lot of time and energy growing small single oysters. This is our main Kumamoto oyster farm in Oakland Bay near the town of Shelton in southern Puget Sound. Millions of delicious Kumamoto oysters there in the photo. And in recent years, our company has expanded our operations up into British Columbia. This unfortunately has been driven a lot by regulations in Washington State. It's very challenging to get farms permitted in Washington. We have a lot of regulations we have to deal with. And so to continue to meet consumer demand here, about 15 years ago, we started acquiring farms up in British Columbia. And it's turned out to be a good move for us. They like aquaculture up in British Columbia and are very supportive of the industry's growth and expansion up there. So it's been a good move, although we'd prefer, frankly, to grow at home if we can. And we're working on that, working to try to improve the regulatory climate there so that can happen. We employ a lot of people processing the shellfish as well. Shucked oyster meats, lots of people in the processing plants. They're cutting oysters out of the shells and packing them into containers for sale in the retail stores and to restaurants and so on. Manila clam harvest as well. Employs a lot of people on their hands and knees raking those clams out of the ground. And then this is a picture from my farm up in Samish Bay in northern Puget Sound. So I've worked over the years to mechanize clam farming and shared that technology with tailors and others in the industry. But I grow clams under these 4-foot wide predator exclusion nets, and then we've mechanized the harvest with a machine. Actually, it's a modified tulip bulb harvester I use to dig my clams. So clams coming in from harvest there and on the table to eat. Geoducks is our most recent product. We started farming these in the early 1990s, and now this year we'll produce roughly 1 million pounds on our farms in Washington State. Same game, they start in the hatchery, then seed gets reared in the nursery and goes out to the farms. They start in these predator exclusion tubes, these net tubes, kind of like a tree protector that you'd see in the forest when they're planting trees. Those 3 geoduck get planted in each one of those tubes. The tubes are on for the first 1 to 2 years, and then the tubes come off, and the geoducks grow for another 4 or 5 years to get to market size. So this is our longest term crop. It takes us about 6 years to get a market size geoduck, and then that's what it looks like at harvest time there. Exceptional looking beast it is. Yeah, gets a lot of media attention. It's quite impressive. They get very big. That's roughly a 2-pound clam there. In the wild, they'll get up to 16 pounds, so a very, very large clam, and what they look like when you go into the sushi bar there. Mussels we grow from rafts suspended in the water column, and that's one of our faster growing crops. The mussels, we can produce a market-ready product in about 14 months there, and that's what you'll see in the restaurants. And speaking of restaurants, we do that as well. We create a lot of jobs upstream, so in our processing plants, and then as you go into market and distribution, lots of opportunity there for employment as well. We call this our Tide to Table experience. So tailors have opened a few oyster bars in Seattle and are enjoying great success with serving the product direct to the consumer. It's been a lot of fun for us. And we do a lot of export. In fact, we have a distribution center in Hong Kong and a couple of oyster bars in Hong Kong as well. Roughly 1/3 of our products are exported. So as I mentioned in my opening comment, that we're doing our part to try to reduce that $11 billion seafood trade deficit that Megan mentioned. Holy smokes, we got a long ways to go there, but we're trying to do our small part. Some of the products you maybe recognize better in the restaurant than on the farms. But so let me shift gears now and talk what I was supposed to come here and talk about is food safety. So we're very fortunate in the United States to have a really robust shellfish sanitation program. It's called the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, or NSSP. It's administered by what's called the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference. So it's a cooperative program modeled after the Interstate Milk Shippers Program. And so the ISSC meets, I forget, Peter, is it every year now or every other year? Every 2 now. Yeah, we've gone back and forth on that. But so they meet every 2, and anybody can submit proposals to change the national regulations. So public health officials can, or if industry finds a regulation is just not working for them, they can submit proposals, and then there's this very formal process whereby those proposals all get deliberated. And then at the end of the day, it's only the public health officials that vote on whether that regulatory change gets made or not. So the fox gets to play in the hen house for the week and have input, but then we're kicked out of the hen house as the final votes occur on those regulations, and then FDA ultimately has the final say on all of the actions the conference takes and whether they can approve them or not. And so protecting public health is the bottom line, but it's a great program because the industry that's being impacted by those regulations gets to come and be part of that conversation and decide whether, you know, that's appropriate. And we clearly have a vested interest in the success of this program. We don't want to make people sick with our product. That really reduces demand. And I was glad to hear from Dr. Paul that the cruise ship industry has claimed the norovirus title. You know, that used to be the shellfish disease, but now it's the cruise ship disease. We're grateful for that. Most of the time, we're really happy with the public health regulations. As I said, sometimes not so happy, and that's where that cartoon got generated a number of years ago over some Vibrio regulations that were being encouraged by FDA, where I don't know if you can read the caption there, but the Fed's handing the new regulations to the oysterman on his boat, and the oysterman saying, mind your own shucking business. So naturally occurring toxins are something that are a big deal for our industry. That's been mentioned by Dr. Paul as well. We suffer from both a number of bacteria, Vibrio bacteria, that create public health issues that aren't necessarily related to pollution, but we still have to monitor for them and protect public health from them, as well as the harmful algal blooms. We have lots of different shellfish diseases. Paralytic shellfish poisoning, of course, is probably the most broadly known, but you have amnesic shellfish poisoning and diuretic shellfish poisoning, all caused by different species of plankton that are in the water that the shellfish are eating, and the shellfish enjoy and doesn't harm the shellfish. Unfortunately, when we eat them, that's not the case. And so, you know, as I said, we've got a very robust program nationally where we're monitoring for these HABs and Vibrios and have appropriate responses as a result to protect public health there. So, and, you know, one of the reasons we're concerned is all these animals that we raise are filter feeders. And so if there's pollutants or HABs in the water, they're taking these in and concentrating them and then become harmful to eat. So, you know, these ecosystem services, these filtration services are valuable for the ecosystem, as you can see in this picture where they're planting out oyster shell to create an oyster reef in New York Harbor to try to clean that water up. Of course, those oysters are not going to be safe to eat, but just to demonstrate how effective these guys are at filtering the water, this is a 28-minute time-lapse video captured in 15 seconds, and you can see how fast those 60 clams clear the algae out of that water. So you can imagine if there's toxins or pollutants in the water, they're picking those up just as fast. So big deal for us. We're constantly, that's a big part of my job for Taylor's, and what I do on behalf of the industry is working on on-site sewage regulations, stormwater regulations, ag runoff regulations to try to prevent those pollutants from getting into our growing areas and closing them down. We do a lot of outreach and education as a company and as an industry, trying to help people make that link between clean water and safe oysters. So ASC, you saw their logo earlier. You know, these are these third-party certifications, not directly playing so much of a role in food safety, although that you are making sure that you're adhering to all of the regulations that you're required to, which include food safety as well as all your environmental sustainability issues as well. Taylor's have worked along with ASC and actually became the first in the country to get certified for shellfish under the ASC, and it's been a valuable program for us. It helps the company continually improve their operations. So I threw in these slides because it was a great opinion piece here that it ran in the James Beard Foundation blog. Barton Seaver is a great advocate for farm seafood and in particular farm shellfish. And it's nice, you know, this not directly related to food safety, but it's really important for the public's grasp of the issue to have these third-party independent voices that can speak on behalf of shellfish farming or finfish farming to give people comfort that this is good product, safe product, sustainable product that's being raised. Barton, you know, beyond sustainable, Barton calls shellfish farming restorative, which is a great term for us. This is and I like that he calls it a patriotic duty that you need to get out and eat more clams and mussels. So yeah, just to sum up what my priorities would be here in Washington, D.C. as we work the Hill this week. You know, efficient, predictable permitting and regulations, you know, this is appropriate for food safety, but across the board for all of our farming operations, frankly. We've heard some messages in the media at the end of last week that were very troubling as far as what's proposed by the administration for NOAA's budget and EPA's budget. And so NOAA obviously on the HABs and the research on the Vibrio research, and USDA as well. Those research and extension programs are incredibly valuable to our industry. And then continued support for ISSC, obviously, and then finally the EPA was slotted for cuts as well in the media Friday, and those estuary restoration programs are really foundational to us addressing the pollution sources that will make your shellfish unsafe to eat. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you very much.